Chapter 3. Again, she heard her father's voice as she turned the piece of card over and over. It must be coincidence. Her father was long gone, as were so many others. The grief, as always at the thought of him, clogged her throat. She missed him so much. But she mustn't allow herself to show anything at all. They were always watching. At the same time, she knew that, if her father were here, he'd be saying to her now, "Think, Nell, think." Hastily, she stuffed the piece of card into her pocket, grabbed her bag, shut her locker, and turned to go. "What is it you want me to think about, Pa?" She searched her mind for a clue as to what he would be pressing her to consider just now. She made herself look at the wider pattern, the overlaps in her various roles that so far she hadn't seen. This was when she realized that antivirals had entered all three of her current existences. Antivirals? Was there any significance in them? After all, they could make the difference between life and death. A recent discovery, Rexovolin, or Rexo as it was more often known, was heavily restricted to those on loyalty lists, that is, not for the rest of us, the rabble that we were. Originally developed for SARS-CoV-4 and quietly repurposed during the VF outbreak, Rexo was restricted, repurposed, and tightly controlled. Of course, General Hawthorne will have been treated with it, except that he'd also been poisoned, so that didn't make much sense. The next picture that came to her mind was Ted's hand when she found him dead. It had held a Rexo ampoule. Had he suddenly been beset with VF? Had he tried to treat himself with the only thing to hand given he was locked in with the General? Or had he been trying to tell her something with that ampoule? Why would it still have been in his hand? If it had been loosely held, it would typically have fallen from his grip as he died with the consequent loss of muscle tone. He must have been gripping it hard. A dying hand doesn't hold on. It lets go. Ted had meant her to see it. And now she had part of the Rexo packaging in her pocket, with a message on it curiously reminiscent of her father. Patterns mattered. She had learned not to ignore them. In the meantime, she must remember to keep her face blank so that those watching saw nothing. Nothing. She moved towards the exit, but before she made it outside, a junior nurse stopped her outside a side room. "Sorry to interrupt, Doctor, but Mr. Jeffries has been asking for you all week. He says you're the only one who listens properly." That caught Eleanor off guard. The interruption jolted her out of her thoughts. It had been so long since she felt like a real doctor. The kind who helped, not hid. "I'll see him now," she said, and she did. By the time she'd finished and finally left the hospital, she'd only gone a few steps before someone dragged her into a long black vehicle. It happened fast. She was too drained to resist, too hungry to think straight. The day had felt like three piled on top of each other. At least this time wasn't quite so frightening, because she'd recognized Greg behind the steering wheel, although she didn't know who he was working for. At the moment, it seemed to be all sides. "Who treated the General before me?" she asked. "There must have been someone." "You're right. There have been 3 so far, including Dr. Ted Richards," Greg replied, staring straight ahead. "You're just the first one to survive this long." Eleanor winced. "And you let them?" "I don't have the power to stop it. I only have the power to show someone like you what the rest of us are trying to change." "Why risk it? I have a daughter." She looked at him properly for the first time. He was younger than he seemed. 35, maybe. Tired. Haunted. "She's got liver issues too?" Greg didn't answer. They arrived back at the underground compound. Not the rebel zone. No, this was the other place. The one with clean walls and no windows. The one where a man who shouldn't have survived was somehow still clinging on. General Hawthorne. The moment she stepped into his private ward, she was struck by how different it felt. Ted's absence was a dark abyss in the room. The desk was stripped bare, the chair pushed back against the wall. The air was cold. There was no sign Ted had ever been here. She busied herself checking Hawthorne's vitals, noting subtle shifts. His eyes and fingernails seemed to her to be a little lemony, but she worried she might be imagining it. The light was uncertain, and she had liver issues on her mind. Then she discovered all General Hawthorne's medical records had gone. Luckily, she was used to making mental notes, but there must be a dodgy reason his notes had disappeared. Then she was refused proper labs. She wanted to run a full panel of blood tests with some added on, but no. That told her they didn't want his condition solved. They wanted it managed, and if he died before their plan for him dictated his demise, they would blame her. Eventually, Greg knocked again. "You've got to come out now. You need sleep." "Sleep," she muttered. "Right." She was taken to the same private quarters as before. Again, there was a basic meal laid out. She ate mechanically, washed, and changed into the spare set of clothes provided. At least she could have clean clothing even if she couldn't properly undress for bed. Again, there was no phone, no news, no means of communication. She might as well be in exile. But as she lay down, there was a scratching at the door. Greg again. She sat up. "What now?" He looked nervous. "You're coming back underground." "I thought I was going to sleep. There's something Thad wants you to see." Wearily, she climbed to her feet, donned her shoes, and they retraced their steps through tunnels and lift shafts. She tried to memorize them, but there were too many. Finally, they were back in the place with low light and too many unwell people in too little space. Thad was waiting. "I wanted you to see this while you're still thinking like a clinician," he said. "We've identified something we can't explain." He led her to a bench in what looked like a converted storage room. On it, laid out with clinical precision, were tissue slides, microscope printouts, and pages of hand-drawn pathology notes. "Off the book's autopsies," he said. "Patients who died from VF-related immune-mediated organ damage, liver, kidneys, lungs. We're seeing repeating patterns, shared inflammatory pathways, possibly early biomarkers." Eleanor stepped closer, drawn despite her exhaustion. "Where did you get all this?" "From people like you," he said. "Doctors who want the truth, not the version we're told to accept." "This is good work," she murmured, moving closer still, wishing she had the hours and freedom to examine every slide. She sat on the stool and picked up the nearest case file. Time blurred. She worked until Greg reappeared and insisted she leave. As they prepared to part, Thad lowered his voice. "You may not have much time. Hawthorne's deterioration was accelerated deliberately. We think there's a second agent, something added to his treatments." "I think Ted tried to tell me," Eleanor whispered, "before he died." Thad handed her an ampoule, identical to the government-issued one Ted had held. "This came from his locker. We've had it analyzed. There's a synthetic compound mixed in, not on any authorized list. We don't know yet if it was only his batch, or if it's in circulation." On the walk back to her room, the implications churned through her. Hawthorne's secrecy, the rebels' trust, Greg's loyalties shifting like weather fronts, and now this. Sleep, when it came, was shallow and short. It was even more of a race than usual to reach her hospital shift before she was reprimanded again. She couldn't afford scrutiny. Not now. It seemed to be a fairly routine day until a patient, a woman admitted for gallstones, developed sudden complications. Elevated liver enzymes, rash, confusion. Eleanor scanned her treatment record. Someone had administered a government-issued supplement the day before. Supplement? What did that mean? She ran off to the pharmacy to request one the same so she could see it. Yes, it was the same antiviral. They were calling it a supplement now? Sounded like a bureaucratic trick. An antiviral relabeled as a supplement would attract fewer questions. Deliberately, she straightened her face as she tried to catch her breath. This looked very like the poison in all these cases, cloaked by the good intentions of a drug that was supposed to save lives. That evening, Greg waited by the ambulance bay. Back underground, Thad greeted her with a nod and handed her a cup of something that might have been tea. "You're paler than usual," he said. "I found a case," she said, ignoring the comment. "A woman upstairs. Same symptoms. The supplements or antivirals appear to be in the public domain, except I have to assume that most of the staff don't know they've been tampered with to make them dangerous." She shook her head as if to dislodge the knowledge of such evil. She was stable, then she wasn't. After the so-called supplement, she muttered. Thad's face darkened. "Then they're testing it openly." "What do you mean? What do you think they're doing?" "They're either killing off those who've had VF knowing that they'll never be as healthy again, by accelerating autoimmune decline in them, or they're developing a new bioweapon, or... I have a patient at the hospital. Gallstone patient. Routine case, nothing unusual, until she got a supplement dose. 12 hours later, she developed rash, brain fog, elevated LFTs. I had them repeat the bloods, but I don't know how long I'll have access to them. You think it's the same compound? I do. Thad looked grim. Then they're spreading it. More than that, she said, her voice low. They're testing it, refining it, and we're watching it happen. A wave of dizziness overtook her at the awfulness of it all. Or maybe it was simply that she was exhausted. Later, in her small room, Eleanor stared at the ceiling. Every thread pulled tighter. General Hawthorne upstairs, patients in a hospital over there, rebels down here, the government watching everything. And she, stretched between worlds, beginning to realize that she soon must choose one of those worlds before she stretched herself too far and broke. Sleep eluded her. Eleanor pushed herself upright on the narrow bed. The room felt smaller than ever, as if the walls inched inwards, shadows thickening in the corners. She couldn't keep reacting all the time. It kept her constantly on the back foot. She must act. If the antiviral supplement had been altered, if it was everywhere, then the entire hospital, every patient, every treatment protocol was compromised. She needed to get her thoughts in order. She needed coherence, not this scatter of competing thoughts. She pressed her hands together, not in prayer, but in concentration. General Hawthorne, Ted's body, the Rexo ampoule, Thad's autopsies, the gallstone patient deteriorating in hours, the renamed supplement, her father's warning, all the threads twisting together. It wasn't possible for them to be kept separate anymore. Sleep had completely given up on her. She needed answers, and they could only be found above ground. She tried the door, expecting it to be locked. But it opened. Maybe they relied on exhaustion and passageways that looped back on themselves, rather than bolts. Eleanor stepped into the corridor, unsure what she intended to do next. She only knew she couldn't stay in that room. But Greg was already there. He must have seen the door open. Had he been standing guard out there? He didn't reach for her arm, nor did he bark an order. He just looked at her, a long, searching look that made it clear he'd already guessed she wasn't going to sleep and wasn't going to stay still. "You want answers?" he said. It wasn't a question. She didn't reply. She didn't need to. After a moment, he exhaled, as if resigning himself to something. "Come with me." He walked unhurriedly ahead of her and opened an unmarked door she hadn't noticed before when she'd been hustled down this corridor. Greg seemed able to access all areas. Behind it was a narrow service passage, the concrete old and the air warmer. "This way goes straight up," Greg said. "It's quicker than the van, leaves less, confusion." So the van had been theatre. Misdirection. She followed him through the passage anyway, and after a short climb, they emerged behind a panel door she recognized instantly, a side corridor of her own hospital. It had been there above them all along. She turned to say goodbye to Greg, and he gave her a quick, tired half-smile, the closest he'd ever come to friendliness. She returned it before he turned back into the passage. The hospital at night had its own rhythm. Softer footsteps, quieter voices, the hum of machines in low-power mode. Eleanor moved through it with the ease of long practice. She had spent years working nights, making decisions when everyone else was too tired to think clearly. She headed for the consultant's office, closest to the lab suites. It was locked, but she knew where they kept spare keys. The security in this hospital was always more theatre than reality. Within seconds, she was inside and facing a clinical workstation identical to the one that had shown her Hawthorne's vanished records. She logged in. The system hesitated, loading her credentials more slowly than usual, almost as if someone had added an extra layer of monitoring. Cold unease prickled her skin. When her profile finally cleared, she typed in General Hawthorne's patient ID. The search flashed red, insufficient authorization. She tried the private ward records. Another red screen. She tried accessing general antiviral stock lists. A third denial. Then an alert popped up. Unusual search activity detected. This has been logged. Her stomach gurgled with fear, and she snatched her hands away from the keyboard, as if the keyboard had burned her. She needed something less visible, something that didn't trigger automated surveillance. A single word flashed in the corner before the page refreshed. Blackend. No context, no definition. She had no idea what it meant. When she blinked, it was gone. The supplement. It was the only thread left to follow. She left the office and slipped along to the lab. The door's keypad glowed faintly. She tapped the emergency override code, technically only for fire drills, and stepped inside before it could lock her out. The lights flickered on automatically. Rows of glass-fronted cabinets gleamed. She headed for the tray of supplies meant for routine patient care. The supplement vials were stacked neatly, identical to the one she'd scanned earlier. She picked one up and for a moment simply held it to the light, rotating it slowly. It looked perfectly ordinary, colorless, unassuming. Nothing about it suggested anything untoward. She drew off a sample into a pipette, placed it on a slide, and slipped it under the microscope. She knew what she was looking for, and more importantly, she knew she'd detect anything that shouldn't be there. And there it was, the faint granular distortion of something synthetic, something that didn't belong in any antiviral she had ever seen. And was that binding protein activity? No, it looked more like a precursor to cytokine dysregulation. Her stomach shuddered. This wasn't contamination. It was design. She snapped a photo on the lab's offline camera, one of the few devices not wired into the central network, and returned the slide to its place. She cleaned everything meticulously. If she left even a hint of interference, they'd trace it back to her. She was placing the vial back into the tray when the auto lights brightened. That must mean movement, not her own. She stilled and listened hard. Footsteps. Someone was coming. She ducked behind the centrifuge just as the door clicked open. A figure walked in. Heavy shoes, slow pace, heavy breathing. It must be a Grimm because he stayed in the doorway and scanned the room with a strong torch. He swept the arc of too bright blue light over benches, cabinets, floor tiles. Eleanor held her breath. He stepped fully inside and headed for the cabinet containing the trays of supplement vials. Eleanor's pulse hammered in her skull. Was he going to actually check a tray? Would he realize one had been moved? He must have been specifically instructed to check those particular items. He lifted the tray, inspected the vials, counted under his breath. 24. 24. He exhaled. Put the tray down, then he turned as if he sensed something behind him. His head went up like an animal sniffing the breeze. Eleanor pressed herself tighter against cold metal, willing her heartbeat to slow down, to beat more quietly. After a moment that lasted far too long, the Grimm left. The lights reset to normal. Eleanor slipped out through the secondary exit, closing the door silently behind her. She didn't see Greg until she reached the ambulance bay. He stepped out of the shadows and hissed, "What did you do? How did you know I did anything?" "Security flagged your login attempt. They're looking for you. Right now. Get in." The door of the black vehicle swung open as if the car itself had been listening. She slid into the back seat and Greg pulled away before she'd even closed the door. "You can't keep doing this," he muttered, taking corners fast. "I can't keep covering for you." "I found the same markers in the supplement," Eleanor said. "It's deliberate." Greg's silence was answer enough. "You knew," she whispered. "I suspected. There's a difference." They drove in tight, rapid turns, making sure no one followed, reaching their destination and racing towards the buildings and down and around corridors. When they reached the lower access hatch, Greg practically pushed her through. "Go," he said. "Find Thad, before someone finds you." Thad was pacing when she arrived underground. "You've been somewhere you shouldn't," he said. "Greg alerted us." "I found more evidence," she countered. "And something else. A term. Blackend." It flashed in a system corner before the page refreshed. Thad stopped moving. The whole space he was in seemed to wait. "Where did you see that?" His voice wasn't much above a whisper. "When I was trying to find information about Hawthorne, private wards, supplements." Thad motioned for Eleanor to follow him into a storage alcove. "Blackend isn't treatment," he said quietly. "It's classification." "For what?" "For patients the government has flagged as expendable." "Expendable how?" "Test subjects," Thad said. "Vectors. Sacrificial cases when outcomes are predicted to be fatal anyway." Eleanor stared at him. "They wouldn't. They would," he said. "And they have. We've seen the aftermath." She shook her head. "Hawthorne's still alive. Only because they haven't finished with him," Thad said. "And that's why you're still breathing. They need you to keep him viable long enough to get the physiological data they want. or to take the blame if he dies before they're done. The storage light flickered. Thad stepped back. We need to move. Now. Why? Because someone's just accessed your hospital login from the security wing's terminal. They're onto me already, Eleanor gasped. No, Thad said grimly. They're onto us. They moved quickly through the tunnels. Eleanor tried to memorize the turns, the sequence of archways, the number of steps between each light. But fear scrambled everything. Faces of the underground volunteers blurred past her. Tired people, sick people, desperate yet determined. She wondered which ones carried blackened tags without knowing. Greg appeared at the far end of the corridor, breathing hard. They're in the building, he said. 2 units of Grims. They've sealed the stairwell. Thad swore under his breath. How did they know to come here? Eleanor wondered, worrying that she'd been followed, that she was the one who'd given up the underground hospital. As if he could read her thoughts, Greg said. One of the medics above ground, cracked under questioning, mentioned a boiler room. They put 2 and 2 together. They're sweeping every lower level. Thad grabbed Eleanor's arm. We have to get you out. But what about everybody else? Before he could answer, the corridor lights cut to emergency red. A mechanical voice boomed overhead. Security breach detected. All personnel remain where you are. Biological hazard protocol initiated. That's not lockdown, Greg said. That's clearance. The word didn't register at first. Clearance? Eleanor queried. They're going to purge the level, Thad said. Anyone found here will be assumed contaminated. A pressure door slammed shut behind them. Greg pushed Eleanor forward. Run. They bolted through the tunnels, turning left, then right, then down a narrow passage that seemed to have been carved out with hand tools. The alarm lights strobed, making shadows jump wildly. Another door slammed. Another. The Grims were getting closer. Here, Thad shouted, wrenching open a side hatch. Through. Eleanor crawled through the narrow opening, the metal scraping her shoulders. She dropped down onto another walkway, steeper, colder, unfamiliar. Greg followed last, sealing the hatch behind him. They had seconds, maybe less. Where does this lead? Eleanor asked. Surface maintenance, Greg said. But it's a risk. Everything is a risk, she muttered. They reached a ladder. Greg went up first, pushing at the ceiling panel. It groaned open. Cold night air poured in. Go, Greg called. Eleanor climbed, fingers slipping, muscles burning. She reached the top and rolled onto rough tarmac, the roof of a service building. The city lights flickered beyond the perimeter guardrails. Greg hauled himself out. Thad followed, breathless and shaken. Below them, the muffled sound of boots echoed through the tunnels. Greg knelt at the vent, listening. What about all the patients, the volunteers, everyone else, the hydroponics, the labs? Eleanor asked. Thad reached out and grasped her arm. He shook her gently. Eleanor, stop it. We're always prepared for this kind of thing. The Grimm's clearance will only be on that level, the in-between level. Our level is under that one, and all entrances to it will have been sealed the moment we knew we'd been detected. We've always known this could and probably would happen. Oh, thank God, she gasped and promptly folded into a heap on the roof. She hadn't, however unintentionally, betrayed the rebels' hospital. She had been so full of fear, that's what she'd done. She looked out across the emptiness of the roof to the city lights beyond. If she understood anything about this night, it was that nothing about her life, nothing, would be going back to normal anytime soon. If ever. Not after this. Not with Blackened in motion. Not with contaminated antivirals, so-called supplements. Not with their movement discovered, even if not the main part of it, the hospital and labs further down. Then came an explosion behind the hatch they'd climbed through to get on the roof. Run, Greg shouted. They ran,